Could you imagine ordinary window glass freezing through, covered with ice, not from the outside, but from inside the room? For families on the American frontier, this was not a rare occurrence, but part of their winter routine. Their huts, built from damp logs or thin planks, barely retained any heat, and nighttime gusts of wind turned their homes into ice boxes where their breath immediately settled as frost on the walls and beds. When the temperature on the Great Plains dropped to incredible lows, no single stove could combat such cold. The heat disappeared instantly, and the only real source of energy was the people themselves. Their bodies, their clothes, their ability to wrap themselves up and conserve every degree, that's what kept them on the brink of survival during the long January nights. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary families turned their beds into engineering structures, why the right sleeping position could save lives, and what price they paid for a single night's sleep by a frozen window, where ice grew faster than the last ember in the stove burned out. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival on the frontier, and it is not the ability to shoot. The settlers' main enemy was the invisible and merciless cold. It was different from what the inhabitants of the eastern states were used to. It was not just frost, but a constant, exhausting assault by the elements. There were no forests on the Great Plains to stop the wind. It raced for hundreds of kilometers, turning -10 into a perceived -30. This wind found the slightest crack in the structure of a house. It penetrated through loosely fitted logs, gaps in door frames, and of course windows. Glass, once a symbol of prosperity, became the main point of escape for precious heat. It instantly cooled to the outside temperature, becoming an icy slab inside the dwelling. In the Rocky Mountains, the cold was different, more severe and immovable. It descended into the valleys like a heavy blanket, freezing the rivers and the ground. Here, the problem was not so much the wind as the absolute cold. In such conditions, any hut, whether log or dug into a hillside, cooled down in a matter of hours after the hearth went out. The settlers quickly realized that their homes were not fortresses, but only temporary shelters. The walls of turf or unfired brick froze through. Inside the room, the air separated into layers. Near the ceiling, where smoke accumulated, it was tolerable. But near the floor, where people slept, the temperature often dropped below zero. The floor was the main danger. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, settled at the bottom, forming an icy lake several inches deep. Standing barefoot on such a floor was not only unpleasant, but dangerous. People constantly risked frostbite without leaving their own homes. The heat from the hearth or stove was not distributed evenly. It created a small oasis of a few square feet around itself. Taking a couple of steps toward the wall meant entering a completely different climate zone. The temperature difference in one room could reach 20 degrees. This constant contrast between the heat of the fire and the icy breath of the walls was physically exhausting. People lived in a state of constant thermal stress. They could not relax because sleeping in the wrong place could be their last. Every night turned into a battle to preserve the heat accumulated during the day. The construction of the houses was primitive, not because of laziness, but because of a lack of materials. There was no timber on the plains to build solid walls. The settlers had to use what was at hand: layers of turf, clay, and willow rods. These materials did not retain heat well and required constant repair. Windows were often covered not with glass, but with oiled paper or cloth. This protected against the wind, but did not save them from the cold at all. If there was any glass, it was single pane and inserted into a rough wooden frame. Gaps between the frame and the wall were inevitable. Families had to develop a complex survival strategy where every object and every action mattered. They couldn't just turn on the heat. They had to actively protect the heat generated by their own bodies. And the main stronghold in this war was the bed. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how modern technology has changed our perception of comfort compared to that era? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn more about real life in the Wild West. Want to know the secret that saved thousands of lives every night? It wasn't technology, but simple human closeness. In conditions where the house couldn't retain heat, the only reliable source of warmth was the family itself. The concept of the family bed was not a matter of upbringing or convenience, but the key to survival. Almost all family members slept together in one or two large beds. Separate bedrooms were an unthinkable luxury and simply dangerous. It was impossible to heat several rooms, so all life was concentrated in one room. This is where they cooked, ate, and slept. The arrangement of bodies in bed was strictly regulated and obeyed the laws of thermodynamics. It was a well-thought-out system designed to maximize the conservation of collective heat. Each family member had their own permanent place, determined by their age and health. The strongest and most resilient adults lay on the edges. Their bodies served as an external barrier, a heat shield that took the brunt of the cold. They slept near the cold outer wall or at the edge of the bed, where the cold came in from the floor. The youngest and most vulnerable members of the family were placed in the center. They were sandwiched between the bodies of the adults. This position provided them with a constant flow of heat from both sides and protected them from any drafts. It was the safest and warmest place in the whole house. This system worked like a single living organism. The heat generated by several bodies accumulated under a common blanket, creating a microclimate. The difference in temperature inside this nest and outside in the room was enormous. This allowed people to sleep while frost formed on the walls. For babies, there were special wooden cradles, which were often placed directly on the bed between the parents. This kept them away from the cold floor and allowed the mother to feed without getting out from under the blanket. Sometimes the cradle was hung from the ceiling, away from the icy drafts near the floor. The psychological aspect was no less important. In complete darkness, listening to the wind howling outside the walls, physical closeness provided a tremendous sense of security. It was not just a matter of sharing warmth, but also of collectively fighting the elements. People literally warmed each other to survive until morning. Of course, such crowding had its drawbacks in terms of hygiene and personal space, but these concepts were a luxury unavailable to those who fought daily for their lives. The choice was not between comfort and discomfort, but between sleeping in warmth and the risk of serious illness. The size of the beds was also different. Often they were not standard double beds, but wide wooden platforms that took up a significant part of the room. Such a platform could accommodate an entire family of 5 or 6 people, lying close together as one. Was this coexistence a burden or the only salvation? Probably both at the same time. But what if I told you that the bed was not the only way to keep warm, and that the most valuable warmth came not only from people? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of what was under and above the sleepers. What I am about to show you was more valuable than gold to any settler family. I am not talking about the bed itself, but what made it warm. Creating a nighttime refuge was a real art, where each layer played a critical role. It was a unique, multi-layered insulation system. It all started with the foundation. Beds almost always had a high frame to raise sleepers as far away from the icy floor as possible. The space under the bed was not left empty. It was often filled with dry straw or even turf, creating an additional insulating barrier from below. The most important element was the mattress, or rather, its substitute. It was a large bag made of coarse fabric, known as a mattress. It was stuffed with affordable insulating material. Most often it was dry straw, which was excellent at trapping air and insulating against the cold. The straw in the mattress had to be changed regularly as it became compacted and absorbed moisture. In the spring, the old straw was taken out, the bag was washed, and in the fall, it was stuffed with fresh straw. In some regions, dried corn leaves or moss were used instead of straw. Sleeping on such a mattress was hard and accompanied by constant rustling. Next came the art of covering. The bottom layer, on top of the mattress, was often covered with coarse woolen blankets. Wool was preferred to cotton because it continued to warm even when slightly damp. Cotton, on the other hand, instantly became an ice pack when wet. The most valuable asset of the family was hides. Processed bison or deer hides served as the ideal top covering. They were placed fur side down on top of the blankets. The thick fur created an air layer, and the thick skin did not allow cold air to pass through from above. Another layer could be placed on top of the skins, heavy canvas or tarred sailcloth. This upper armor served as a windbreak. It prevented drafts from entering the warm nest and blowing out the accumulated heat. Finally, on top of all this were patchwork quilts. Women sewed them during long winter evenings from every available scrap of fabric. A quilt was not just a decoration, but an essential technological element. Multiple layers of fabric quilted together created a light but very warm layer. Sometimes beds were equipped with a canopy. This was not a luxury item, as in European castles, but a harsh necessity. Curtains made of any thick fabric surrounding the bed cut off the sleepers from the main volume of the cold room. They created a tiny space that could be warmed up with just one breath. This whole multi-layered construction, straw at the bottom, wool, skins, quilts, and canvas at the top, and curtains on the sides, turned a simple bed into an individual shelter. It was a complex engineering system created from materials at hand. It allowed people to survive the night when the icy wind of the prairies howled outside the walls. Did you enjoy this detailed breakdown of survival materials? If so, please like this video to let us know that you are interested in such details of pioneer life. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how homes on the frontier were actually heated? We are used to thinking that every home had a cheerfully crackling fireplace, but the reality was quite different. Maintaining a fire was hard and dangerous work that determined the entire daily routine of the family. In the earliest and most primitive dwellings, such as dugouts or semi-dugouts, the hearth was open. It was located directly on the earthen floor in the center of the room. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. This system was extremely inefficient, and most of the heat escaped along with the smoke. Fireplaces appeared in log cabins. However, these were not the elegant fireplaces we see in movies. They were often made of clay, mixed with grass or wood chips, and reinforced with rods. This design was a fire hazard and required constant supervision and repair. The main problem with the fireplace was its low efficiency. It gave off powerful radiant heat in the immediate vicinity, but at the same time worked like a giant pump. It sucked warm air out of the room and threw it outside, sucking in icy air through all the cracks in return. Therefore, you could only sit facing the fire. Your back could literally freeze. People constantly turned around to warm up evenly. It was like rotating a spit over a fire. The main task was to keep the fire from going out at night. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel was a long and laborious process. Therefore, every evening, a ritual of preserving the coals was performed. The largest logs were covered with a thick layer of ash, blocking the access of oxygen. In the morning, the first person to wake up would dig up the ashes. The smoldering coals were carefully fanned, adding dry kindling. If the coals did go out, it was a minor disaster. People had to go to their nearest neighbor, sometimes several miles away, to borrow some fire in a special metal container. Preparing firewood was a separate titanic task. There was almost no wood on the Great Plains. Settlers had to collect dry branches along rivers or use buffalo dung, dried bison manure, as fuel. It was collected in the summer and stacked in wood piles like firewood. But even the hottest fire was useless if the heat escaped through the walls. In the next chapter, you will learn how the settlers turned their leaky huts into something resembling a thermos. The turning point in the settlers' lives was the advent of the cast iron stove. This invention, which came from the East by railroad, caused a real revolution. Unlike an open fireplace, the stove was a much more efficient and safer source of heat. The main advantage of the stove was that it was enclosed. The combustion process took place inside a metal casing. This made it possible to control the air supply with a damper and regulate the intensity of the flame. Wood or coal burned more slowly and more completely. The entire surface of the stove, the top, sides, and even the pipe, became hot and radiated heat in all directions. The heat was distributed much more evenly throughout the room than from a fireplace. This eliminated the sharp contrast between a scorched face and a frozen back. The stove could be placed in the center of the room instead of against the wall. This made it the true heart of the home. The family could gather around it and everyone was equally warm. This changed the social dynamics within the home. Food could be cooked on the flat-top surface of the stove. This was much more convenient than cooking over an open fire in the fireplace. Now there was no need to lean over the fire to cook soup or boil water. Many models had several burners and even a small oven. The stove consumed significantly less fuel than a fireplace. The same amount of firewood produced many times more useful heat. For regions where wood was in short supply, this was a decisive factor. Saving fuel meant saving time and effort. The stovepipe, which ran through the room, also gave off heat. This was much more efficient than a wide fireplace chimney, which simply threw the heat out into the street. A metal pipe was easier to install and safer than a chimney made of clay and sticks. Of course, the stove had its drawbacks. It was expensive. Transporting heavy cast iron deep into the continent cost a lot of money. Often, several families would chip in to buy one stove for everyone. With the spread of railroads, stoves became more accessible. They became as much a symbol of civilization as glass windows or sewing machines. Having a stove meant that a family had settled permanently in a new place. What if I told you that even the best stove was useless without one simple procedure? The secret to preserving heat lay not only in producing it, but also in retaining it. The log cabin, which became a symbol of the frontier, was actually like a sieve. Logs, even well-hewn ones, never fit together perfectly. Significant gaps and cracks remained between them. Cold wind blew freely through these cracks, blowing out precious heat. The process of filling these gaps was called chinking, or caulking. It was one of the most important and labor-intensive tasks in building and preparing a house for winter. The quality of this work directly determined whether the family would survive the cold. Whatever was available was used as a caulking material. In wooded areas, it was moss. It was collected, dried, and tightly packed into the gaps between the logs. Moss was an excellent natural insulator that retained heat well. In the plains where there was no moss, a mixture of clay and dry grass or straw was used. This viscous mass, similar to adobe, was carefully smeared over all the joints. The clay dried, forming a hard but brittle crust. The problem with clay putty was its short lifespan. The wooden log house constantly breathed. The logs dried out, swelled from moisture, and settled. The clay cracked and fell out, opening the way for drafts. Therefore, the house had to be caulked every fall. Sometimes wooden chips or strips of fabric were first stuffed into the cracks, and only then were they filled with clay. This created a more durable and flexible base. The whole process was dirty and painstaking work that took several days. Special attention was paid to the corners of the log house and the places where the door and window frames joined. These were the most problematic areas, where the cracks were widest. Sometimes the frames were wrapped in old rags in an attempt to create a seal. How do you think modern people, accustomed to central heating, would be prepared for such painstaking preparation for winter? In the next chapter, we will talk about what people wore to bed, because a warm bed alone was not enough. As darkness fell and the hearth cooled, the temperature in the hut dropped sharply. Even under a mountain of blankets and skins, the cold crept into the body. Therefore, the pioneers did not know such luxuries as light pajamas or nightgowns. They slept in clothes that were more like protective gear. The basis of their nightwear was long underwear. Often, this was a one-piece jumpsuit known as a union suit. It was made of wool or thick cotton, buttoned at the front, and had a distinctive flap at the back. This jumpsuit covered the entire body from the neck to the ankles and wrists. It served as the first barrier, retaining heat directly against the skin. It was not taken off for weeks, especially in severe frosts. Washing in such conditions was a rare and difficult task. People often wore additional clothing over their underwear. This could be the same everyday shirt or pants they wore during the day. Taking off clothes before bed meant voluntarily giving up warmth. Special attention was paid to the feet. Cold feet prevented sleep and could lead to frostbite. Therefore, thick woolen socks were a must for sleeping. Often, 2 or even 3 pairs were worn. A lot of heat was lost through the head. To prevent this, both men and women often slept in headgear. These were special nightcaps, knitted hats, or simply scarves tied tightly around the head. On the harshest nights, people could even sleep in their outer clothing, simply loosening their belts. Sheepskin coats or heavy jackets served as an additional layer of insulation. Sleep was not so much a rest as a respite in the fight against the cold. Sleepwear was not about style, but about survival. Every layer of fabric, every button had one purpose: to retain precious body heat. It was real night armor against the cold. Even with the stove running and the walls sealed, the cold in the hut was distributed extremely unevenly. There were areas where the frost reigned supreme. The walls, especially the outer ones, were one such area. Since most huts had no interior paneling or insulation, the logs or turf froze through. The inner surface of the wall was almost the same temperature as the street. Any moisture in the air in the room instantly condensed on it. On frosty nights, this moisture turned into frost. The walls were covered with a beautiful but ominous white pattern. Touching such a wall in your sleep meant getting an icy burn. Therefore, beds were always moved away from the outer walls. If the room was humid enough from people's breath or cooking, real ice could form on the walls. In the morning, the settlers could scrape the ice crust off the logs. This showed how weak the house's protection against the elements was. The blankets and skins that covered the sleepers also fell victim to this process. Warm, moist air from people's breath rose upward. Coming into contact with the icy air in the room, it condensed on the top layer of bedding. By morning, the top blanket or bison skin could be covered with a crust of frost. They became stiff and cold. They had to be carefully dried by the fire during the day so that they could perform their function again at night. Any metal object in the house turned into an icy trap. Nails, door handles, staples. They all froze and became covered with frost. Touching them with bare skin could cause the skin to instantly freeze to the metal. As we mentioned earlier, cold air always sinks. In a poorly insulated pioneer cabin, the floor was the coldest place in the entire house. The temperature difference between floor level and an adult's head could be enormous. The floor in early dwellings was often just packed earth. It froze just like the street. Even in later houses with wooden floors, the boards were laid with gaps and icy air constantly blew from under them. This phenomenon of a cold lake on the floor was the main threat to sleepers. Going to bed on the floor meant almost guaranteed frostbite or serious illness. Therefore, all sleeping furniture was designed with this danger in mind. Beds were always made with high legs. The higher a person slept from the floor, the warmer the air layer they were in. This height was not a whim, but a necessity. The space under the bed was also used for insulation. As already mentioned, it could be filled with straw. Sometimes supplies that could be damaged by frost, such as potatoes, were stored there. Some houses used pull-out beds. During the day, they were pushed under the parents' high bed to save space. At night, they were pulled out, but sleeping on them was much colder because they were lower. Those who did not have enough space on the main bed slept in the attic. It was a relatively warm place, as all the smoke and heat from the hearth rose upwards. However, the roofs often leaked, and sleeping there was not always comfortable. The window in the pioneer's hut was the weakest point of defense against the cold. The single-pane glass had no insulation. On a frosty night, a thick layer of ice formed on the glass from inside the room. This ice was not just frost, but a solid crust that barely let the morning light through. It was impossible to melt it with the heat of the room. This ice served as a visual indicator of temperature. The thickness of the ice allowed one to judge how harsh the night had been. Sometimes the ice was so thick that the window could not be opened until spring. Any bed next to the window was a bad place. A constant, piercing cold emanated from the glass. It felt physical, as if there was an open refrigerator standing nearby. People who slept by the window had to cover themselves up extra carefully. They took the brunt of the cold, protecting those who slept closer to the center of the room. It was a kind of night watch. Often windows were boarded up for the winter. They were closed from the inside with wooden shutters, stuffed with rags or straw. This plunged the room into semi-darkness, but allowed precious heat to be retained. The light from the hearth or a torch became the only source of illumination. When people woke up in the morning, the first thing they did was look at the window. If it was covered with a thick layer of patterns, it meant that the day would be frosty, and it was not worth going outside unless absolutely necessary. The window was both a barometer and a calendar. We have looked at how families survived on the American frontier in extreme cold. Their methods may seem primitive to us today, but they were the result of hundreds of years of experience and a deep understanding of the laws of nature. The family bed, multi-layered blankets, the battle for fire, and caulking the walls were all part of a single strategy. These people lived in a world where comfort was a luxury and warmth was a precious commodity. They learned to turn their bodies into stoves and their beds into impregnable fortresses. This is a story not only of hardship, but also of incredible resilience, adaptation, and the strength of family bonds. What other aspects of the lives of pioneers or Wild West residents would you like to see in our future videos? Perhaps you are interested in how they obtained and stored food, or how they built their first homes from scratch? Write your ideas in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories.